Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on, Brandon DaCruz. We're going to do part two here of his evolving views on, last episode we did training. Now we're going to do some nutrition, metabolism, and body comp related topics. So looking forward to diving into it, man. Thanks for coming back on here for part two.
Absolutely, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Yep. Normally I'd say, hey, what's been going on? But we just chatted a couple weeks ago about it. So we're gonna get right into the topics here, man. So the first one, we were just kind of talking off air. We're gonna hit on metabolic adaptation, but metabolism related topics as well. So yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to you and just kind of, your evolving views on it, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So initially, when you had come to me with this topic, it was an all-encompassing topic on how have my views shifted, or how have my views on different fitness and nutrition and body composition related topics evolved. And honestly, we did part of it last week, and we were able to really tie up training as a whole. But obviously, this was a pretty in-depth topic because you had asked me about, how have my evolved my training, or my thoughts shifted and evolved on not only like my coaching ideologies, but topics such as, metabolism, metabolic adaptation, body composition. And we're going to go all through that. So today will be more of the metabolism and nutrition related. And, anyone in the audience can go back to our previous episode and go through all the training, like all the individualized training things that we spoke about in the previous episode. So when it comes to how my views have evolved on metabolism related topics, I think really when I come to think about this, the two biggest shifts that I've had is how I view metabolism from a total daily energy expenditure perspective across different sexes and age demographics. And as well, the secondary thing that I've really shifted my thoughts on, just due to new evidence and also working with more and more people, this was kind of like, what have I changed my thoughts on or evolved my thoughts on in the last 3 to 5 years? That's hundreds of more people that I've worked with. That is dozens of, probably hundreds of more papers that I've read as well. And so the secondary thing would be the role that metabolic adaptation plays in weight regain. And so I'm personally, and you know me very well, I'm personally someone who's very data driven and who tries to be really objective when it comes to taking on any new research and expanding my views on different topics, especially as a body of literature builds up on a specific topic. And we see, and as we see multiple well-controlled, studies finding similar outcomes and pointing in the same direction, we have to think if this is how most people in the general population will be able to interpret these things. So a lot of times when we get data, a lot of people will develop opinions on complex topics like metabolism, and they do so first based on their own personal anecdotes. And they also tend to overlook and disregard research, mainly because they don't have a background in interpreting research. So they usually don't even look into these topics. And although I never want to dismiss, and I never would dismiss a client's past experiences, I think a lot of people often will confuse like correlation, like what they're seeing in the real world, with causation. So they misinterpret their own data. And so when it comes to interpreting, and when it comes to topics such as metabolism, I find that many are still under the impression that their metabolism naturally drops as they get older. And I also find a lot of women who believe that they naturally have a slower metabolism than men do. And this is actually a topic that we've gotten, a lot more data on in the last couple of years. So I'll tell you personally, I've coached clients of all ages and sexes over the last decade, ranging from like your college students. So we're talking people in their late teens and early 20s. And then I even have grandparents. So I've worked with people all the way up to around 80 years old. And so that's a wide demographic to be looking at things. But the vast majority of clients that I work with these days are in their mid 30s to mid 40s. And I can't tell you how many times a new client will come to me, and they'll be between that age group of like 35 to 45, which is really like my main demographic. And they'll tell me that during our initial consultation call, that their metabolism isn't the same as it was in their 20s. And a lot of times what they'll say is that they associate the weight that they've gained since they've left college with their metabolism having slowed down. So that's like the main like thing that they focus on. Like they're like, listen, I have a slower metabolism than I did previously. I eat the same way, or I can't get away with the same things that I used to. However, not only does the research not support the idea that our metabolism slows down from our 20s to our 40s, but I also have seen, when I really haven't seen that to be the case when working with these clients in the real world, because when I've taken these same individuals who claim that their metabolism is slower than it was, say, a decade or two previously, and I've dialed in their nutrition, I prioritized their protein intake, I've put them on a well-constructed progressive resistance training program, and really gotten them focused on building muscle, and I've helped increase their physical activity levels. Like I'm pulling all these vectors, all these levers are being pulled, and they're being really formulated into a plan that complements one another. So nutrition is being matched with training. Everything's pairing one another. I've seen these same clients who have felt stuck for years make tons of progress and be able to effectively lose body fat and gain muscle. And oftentimes, like after a year or so of us working together and then being on a periodized and phasic approach to their nutrition and training, they look way better than they did like now than they did even in their 20s and their early 30s, even though that was 10 or 20 years prior. So there's many times that I've asked, specific clients, they've said, listen, I really want to go back to the physique that I had when I was in my 20s, when I was in college, or when I was just getting into the corporate world. So oftentimes I'll tell them, listen, send me over a picture just so I can see what their frame looks like. A lot of times I really want to get an idea of like what their previous body fat level was in comparison to where they are now, where they've been more sedentary. Obviously, nutritional habits have fallen off, as well as like their activity. They're not as active as they were previously. And when I look back a lot of times and I compare where they are a year later after we've dialed everything in as compared to where they were, say, 20 years ago, often they've excelled past where they were previously. And it's just because, in our mind, we have often things, in hindsight, they look better than they actually were. So we have these rose colored glasses, essentially. So this was something that I've been seeing in practice for years personally, but it wasn't up until 2021 when a paper was released by Ponser and colleagues on how total daily energy expenditure changes over the life course that we've actually had some solid research on this topic, because there was a lot of debate. A lot of people, even practitioners within our space, used to actually like give into that notion that yes, your metabolism slows when you get older. And it would always be like this thing that would just be thrown into the ether. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is when we hear something repeatedly, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It just becomes like part of our culture. And more something is said, the more it's believed. And so then it's really hard to kind of retract those statements and get people to get out of that, self-limiting belief narrative, essentially. And so when we look at the study by Ponser and colleagues, this was a study where they took over 6,000 people ranging from 8 days old to up to 95 years old, and used the gold standard of measuring total daily energy expenditure in humans, which is the doubly labeled water method. So what they did with that was they used it to measure their daily energy expenditure and found that our total daily energy expenditure is stable from the ages of 20 to approximately 60. And it's only after that, after the age of 60 years old, that we start to slowly see a decline in our actual total daily energy expenditure. So for everyone out there, yes, our metabolism does get slower, but we're talking about well into our 60s. So for those of you who are, between 20 and 60 and have gained weight and are having a tougher time losing weight, it isn't because you're experiencing a natural decrease in your metabolism, but more so because your current lifestyle is much different than it was in the past. And you're most likely not as active as you were, say, in your 20s, when really you're looking back and you're saying, oh, that's when I attained my best physique. And also, you haven't adjusted your nutritional intake to account for the decrease in the amount of calories you burn per day now as compared to where you were in college, where you were way more active. To go along with that, another thing, and this is something that I constantly find myself having conversations with my clients. I do many podcasts on this. I mean, I just did a whole series with our buddy Jeremiah on female specific fat loss. And one of the biggest things that I have, every time I get on a consultation with a woman, I'll say 9 out of 10 times, a lot of them think that they have slower metabolisms than males do. And a lot of times and they have personal anecdote. Like, I struggle more with losing fat than my husband does or than my boyfriend does. And so that kind of just reinforces that belief. And so a lot of times they think it's their actual metabolic rate, which is holding them back from attaining the body composition that they want, or the weight loss or the fat loss that they want. And when we actually look into literature on this, we can look just at that exact same study by Ponser and colleagues, because they specifically compared the total daily energy expenditure between men and women and found that when they accounted for each sex's amount of fat-free mass, which includes both your muscle and then organ mass and things of that sort, we have the same relative levels of energy expenditure. Now, the reason why we usually observe that a woman's maintenance calories are lower than a men's maintenance calories, and we can see this with ourselves, with our partners, as well as with our clients, is because the difference in body weight and body composition. Because if we actually look between the differences of the two, if you just look statistically, women generally carry about 10% more body fat because of the differences in essential body fat, but also they generally carry about 10% less lean mass than men do. And so within that, they also weigh significantly less than us. So if we were to compare a woman who's, say, 130 pounds and then her husband who's 200 plus pounds, they're both going to maintain their weights on vastly different amounts of calories. So often that gets conflated with, oh, I have a slower metabolism. No, you have a much smaller body that requires much less energy to move it. However, say that we have a female and a male client that weigh the same. They have the same level of lean mass, the same level of fat mass, and they have the same physical activity level. So we put them on the same amount of steps, same amount of training program. The female client will burn just as much calories as the male client does. And that's because we're relativizing or we're essentially equating body composition. So our sex alone doesn't independently determine the amount of calories we burn per day, as the strongest influence on our total daily energy expenditure is the amount of metabolically active fat-free mass we carry, not our sex. And I find this to be a really important topic to touch on with many clients, as many times coaches within our fitness industry do sell these fragility narratives, especially to women. And we hear about these concepts, and I'm sure, Jeff, you're familiar with them. They'll say you're metabolically resistant. You have fat loss resistance or weight loss resistance. And what ends up happening is these individuals, especially these females, take that on. It's almost like a label. It's almost like a disorder that they take on to themselves. And then they feel like they can't effectively lose fat, and that the previous experiences that they've had, whether it be struggling to lose fat or they've lost fat and then regained it quickly, is because of this metabolic resistance, or it's because of being weight loss resistant. And then they think that they need some, special protocol to be able to solve this, when it really isn't the case. You are very much able to lose body fat, and sometimes you just need a more intelligent, structured and strategic approach. But it's not that your metabolism is directly holding you back from being able to go through the process of lipolysis or body fat loss. And so that's a really big thing that we need to be aware of, because a lot of times we as coaches, obviously, you and I both have a background in physiology. We study these things, but coaching is not just physiology. It's not just the X's and O's of macros and calories, for nutrition or sets and reps in the gym. It's also a client psychology. And one of the biggest things that I've learned over the decade plus that I've been coaching is, if someone is not in the right mental headspace, especially when it comes to a fat loss phase, that's going to be their self limiter or their rate limiter for their progress. That's going to be the biggest bottleneck that holds them back from making true progress. Because whenever they hit a challenge or an obstacle in the road or a hurdle, instead of taking a step back and just being objective with themselves, listen, we all struggle. Fat loss is not a linear process. I just need to push forward. I need to take these, the bumps on the road, take them on the chin and keep it moving. Oftentimes they catastrophize those things. And what they think is, this is because I'm weight loss resistant. That former, functional nutrition practitioner that told me I was weight loss resistant, he was right. I cannot do this. And that only makes the process more difficult from a mental perspective. But often it's not only more challenging from a mental perspective, but often people won't even push themselves to go past those hurdles, to overcome those plateaus. And it causes them to get like this, the F effect, or the what the hell effect, essentially, where now they're frustrated and maybe they slipped off of their diet. And instead of just recalibrating and really rethinking things and saying, all right, you know what? I slipped up in the moment, but this is not the end. You know what I mean? You are always one meal, one choice away from being back on track. Instead of doing that, you decide to take kind of like the ideology of, like, if you had a flat tire, would you slash all three other of your tires? No, you would get a replacement. And so instead of moving forward, a lot of these times, these people, because they have these self-limiting beliefs and they've been sold these fragility narratives around having conditions like weight loss resistance, which we don't even see in the literature, it's like, they think that that's really the cause of their issues and that they're never going to be able to overcome it. So then when they do have a slip up, they just say, F it. You know what? I'm just going to eat whatever I want. And that only pushes them further back from their goal, and really does cause a plateau to go from being a stalling of progress to a regression in progress, where they start accumulating weight, they feel really discouraged, and it's just like this vicious cycle.
Yep. And then that leads to, again, even worse body composition. Then you're kind of making up for that potentially down the line. So cool. So it sounds like from a metabolism standpoint, the big thing for you is, it's, a lot of times people think, like you said, they think they're weight loss resistant, but at the end of the day, it's like, it kind of comes down to what you're doing and your inputs there that are going to be the most important. I know you hit on a few of them, muscle being important. Is there any others that you would say are going to be like important from a lifestyle perspective there on that to kind of, help with that?
Absolutely. So we can look at many different factors that are going to influence someone's metabolism. So the number one correlate, or the strongest correlate that we have to increase energy expenditure, is your level of fat-free mass or lean mass. So that's just the muscle that you have. But the other vector of that would be movement, physical activity. How active are you? Because our NEAT contributes such a vast majority of the calories you burn per day that often we're going to burn a substantially larger amount of calories per day through NEAT, so non-exercise activities, than we are in the gym. You're accounting for about 5% in the gym, but you're getting 25+% from your NEAT. So that is where being very active, going on walks, going on post-meal walks, just keeping your steps up, can really be a huge tool in our toolbox to be able to increase our energy expenditure. And we've done podcasts on this. I have a energy flux model essentially that I utilize with a lot of clients. essentially what I'm trying to do is get them to eat more and move more. And so we're complementing those things. Just like I said with the training, where I'm really trying to improve someone's body composition by pairing their training and their nutrition. I'm doing the same thing with their nutrition, their activity levels. And I'm trying to really get them into this higher flux model where they're eating more, they're moving more, they're also burning more as a result, because now they're not in this down-regulated state. Another thing is we can look at the macronutrient composition of the diet. A lot of, especially women, are under consuming protein. Now, protein has the highest thermic effect of feeding. So that is one easy way to almost be like a caloric funnel. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to do a calorie equated comparison between protein, carbs, and fats, we see that protein has such a dramatically higher thermic effect. So we're looking at, between 20 and 30% of calories being burned, from protein. Whereas if we look at carbs, it's about 5 to 10%. If we look at fats, it's like 0 to 3%. So we're going to be much less likely to store protein as actual body fat, or to go through the entire process, to be able to convert protein into carbohydrates, into, and then go through the process of de novo lipogenesis to actually become fat. And so that is one way we can just increase calorie expenditure. It's going to increase your metabolic rate. There is some research that shows an increase in resting metabolic rate from higher protein consumption. And so little things like that could really move the ball forward in terms of being able to maximize your metabolism. So instead of thinking as it as my metabolism is broke, or I am suffering from having a suppressed or a low metabolism, it's just, what are the inputs that I can modulate within my lifestyle, within my approach to nutrition, within my training, within my activity levels, that are going to maximize my ability to be able to handle more calories, to be able to partition them readily into more muscle mass than it is fat storage, and then also to be able to live a life of abundance, essentially. And that's really what I try to preach with a lot of my clients within that high flux model. It's like, listen, there is a time and a place to diet and to be in a calorie restricted state. If you want to liberate body fat and lose a substantial amount of body fat, you're going to need to be in a calorie deficit. We're not we're not undoing the laws of thermodynamics. However, I would rather have someone in a higher flux model most of the year, but also even during a fat loss phase. I would rather them do a little bit more activity and be able to eat a little bit more. We're going to get more flexibility within your actual total calorie intake. You're going to have more calories to play with, but also you're going to get more micronutrients. You're going to get more polyphenols, more cofactors, enzymes, things of that sort, that are going to come with the increased nutrient density of the diet and the bigger budget that you have to play with.
Yeah, I've always kind of said, and this kind of lines up with kind of my thoughts on it, is that, it's, instead of saying, hey, I have a slow metabolism, like, it's, again, you got to look at your inputs. Is it's probably the methods that you're taking there that are likely causing you to maybe have it be a little bit slower, right? So I think really paying attention to that can be super helpful. Now, I guess two things on this, and maybe we can tie this into the metabolic adaptation. But one of the things that we talked about, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought here. So, God, what were we talking about right before that?
We were just going through increasing metabolism.
Well, I was gonna say, man, freaking people lose. Well, let's tie it into metabolic adaptation. It's gonna come back to me. I know it is. So, like, I guess here with this, how big of a role do you think that this is what I was gonna say? Okay, sorry. Genetically, obviously, again, we want to pay attention to our inputs, right? Like, those are going to be the most important. You definitely look at that. But, from a genetic standpoint, do you think there are probably some people, though, that, maybe some things might just tend to be a little bit slower? Or is there anything like that you do see that can slow things down a little bit from that standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to realize and be very aware and acknowledge the fact that genetics kind of rule the roost. And I'm not saying that in a pessimistic fashion where we have to just focus on genetics, but really, when it comes down to it, I have these conversations many of times where clients will come to me and say, I think I'm genetically have a slow metabolism. And there are people that they either have a thrifty metabolic phenotype, so they downregulate energy expenditure more precipitously when being in an energy deficit, and they have less of an upregulation in energy expenditure when going into a surplus. And actually, we had covered this on a podcast way long ago. So if anyone's interested in what the broad classification would be called metabolic phenotypes, we did a podcast on this years ago. And so we have two essentially metabolic phenotypes. So we have spendthrift metabolic phenotypes and thrifty metabolic phenotypes. So thrifty, they downregulate energy expenditure more during a deficit, and they upregulate less during a surplus. And then we have spendthrift, where they upregulate energy expenditure more during being in a calorie surplus, and then they downregulate energy expenditure much less during a deficit. So for the same, say, if we equated a calorie deficit, we put two individuals, we put a spendthrift individual and a thrifty phenotype into a 500 calorie deficit, we could expect that, over the course of a fat loss phase, the spendthrift is going to lose a little bit more weight. But here's the thing: when we actually look in the literature on that, and there's been more evolving literature on that, is that it's more of a spectrum. It's never you're just one or the other. So yes, we're all going to fall along this spectrum and essentially along a continuum. So some people are going to have naturally slower, I guess we could say lower total daily energy expenditures or slower metabolic rates than others. However, we can't look at that as like this fatalistic narrative. We have to realize that we have to focus on what's within our control. So what is within our control? What's within our control is the rest of the factors within our total daily energy expenditure. So we have our thermic effective eating, which could come from the macronutrient perspective, our intake. We have our NEAT activity, so we have physical activity levels, and we also have our exercise activity thermogenesis. So that makes up 3 out of the 4 portions of our total daily energy expenditure. But the other thing that's fairly modifiable is our level of muscle mass. So we can engage in more resistant training. We can increase our level of muscle mass. We can fuel ourselves, well and efficiently during a building phase and make sure we try to pack on as much muscle as possible so that we're in the most advantageous position for when we do go into a fat loss phase.
Yep. So, and again, I think a lot of people probably underestimate, how much muscle they have as well too, right? And I think that is definitely something people overlook. Real quick, that episode 118 that we talked about metabolic phenotype. So check that out there on that. So what about, so again, to kind of sum this up so far, again, it's, hey, like, you probably don't have a slow metabolism. You just need to focus on your inputs. However, some people potentially could be expending a little less energy. Again, you can't really do anything about that though. Again, I think if you have these inputs down, you're still going to be in a good spot there. What about metabolic adaptation? Where are you kind of at with that? Because my kind of views on this is I used to think it was a huge deal, but as I've learned a little bit more about it, it still plays a role, but maybe not as much. So I'm curious to kind of hear where your thoughts are around that topic.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm definitely in agreement with you. And I think that this has been like one of my hobby horses for quite some time. I've done dozens of podcasts on the topic of metabolic adaptations. And if you guys go back like four years or so, you'll hear my thoughts and my notions and my interpretation of the research evolve because really within the last 2 to 3 years, we've had a ton of literature that has really pushed our field forward on this topic. And particularly like the base level of the physiology of what happens during fat loss. We've known that since the 90s. We've known that honestly since the Minnesota semi-starvation study. And that was in 1944. So we've known the physiological, ramifications of being in energy deficit, down regulations in energy expenditure, down regulations in hormonal production, and then mitochondrial efficiency, which also lowers our net, calorie burn essentially. But really what has changed within the last couple of years is whether the degree of metabolic adaptation that someone suffers or experiences during a diet predicts their likelihood of weight regain after the diet has ended. So I find, and this is something that has been very consistent that I've really encountered, and this comes from both clients as well as other fitness professionals. I still find this that many are under the impression that metabolic adaptation persists long term, or that it can, and thus they believe that if they're the type of person who adapts quickly, so if they are that's thrifty metabolic phenotype, so they downregulate energy expenditure quite precipitously or quickly when entering an energy deficit, then they automatically doomed to regaining all the weight that they lost and then some. So they think that they're going to be automatically predisposed towards rapid weight regain. And I do understand why many people think this, because if we look at dieters in the general public, many of whom try to lose weight each year and try to do so on their own without any coaching or any professional guidance, the vast majority of those individuals will regain the weight that they lost. But I also, I think that many blame metabolic adaptation to be the cause of that, when in reality, we really have to tease out the root causes of things. And really, when it comes down to it, the reason why we see that weight regain is so prevalent, especially within the general population, is due to 2 things. First of all, they're following suboptimal approaches to dieting in the first place, where a lot of them, many individuals, and I'm sure you encountered this as well, Jeff, they'll try to lose weight as quickly as possible. They want it off as quickly as possible. And what ends up happening with that is they end up losing a ton of lean mass in the process. So then they experience this rapid rebound after, and many end up experiencing the body fat overshoot effect, where they regain more fat after the diet has ended than they actually lost in the first place. And then couple that with the fact that many dieters are just so focused on the diet itself and on losing weight that once they hit their goal, it's like they almost look at it as it's a finish line instead of looking at it as a checkpoint along their journey. And so very few of them actually have an exit strategy in place to get back to maintenance after the diet has ended, to reverse the metabolic adaptations that they did incur while being in a deficit, and to maintain their new leaner body composition and really get their systems back online essentially. However, the claim that metabolic adaptation, or the degree of metabolic adaptation you experience during an active weight loss phase, predicts the amount of weight you'll regain after finishing a fat loss phase is not something that's substantiated by the most recent evidence that we have on this topic. So, for example, there's actually just been a few very well controlled studies and reviews done by Dr. Katia Martin's group, and she has done an immense amount within the space of metabolic adaptation, especially within the last 5 years. And they've directly investigated whether there's a relationship between metabolic adaptation, or the amount of metabolic adaptation that someone experiences, and predicted weight regain. So in a 2020 study by Martins and colleagues, they looked at the degree of metabolic adaptation during a diet and weight regain in over 170 women. So this was a large population of women, and they lost a significant amount of body fat. So I believe off the top of my head, this was 16+% of body weight in this study. And at the end of the active dieting phase, they measured these participants' metabolic rate and saw that they had a little over a 50-calorie drop in their resting metabolic rate, which was due, it is attributed to metabolic adaptation. So they lost a substantial amount of body weight. We would expect, as a lighter, leaner individual, that the resting metabolic rate would be lowered. That's just a normal physiological effect of being in a diet. However, what they did with this study, which is much different than many of the dieting studies. So what I would love people to understand a little bit more, especially when interpreting research. A lot of times when we speak on these topics, people are abstract warriors, essentially. They only read the abstract. They don't read the supplementary materials. They don't really go into the methods, the discussion aspect. So a lot of times when we see metabolic adaptation, that is taken during active weight loss. We see this when the participants of the study are currently in an energy deficit or just finished the diet. So they're in a state of negative energy balance, which we know that even a day of underfeeding can lower your resting metabolic rate, can lower your total daily energy expenditure. It's just a natural response to you eat less, you burn less. And so what this study, or what this group did that was a little bit different than many do, is that they not only did that post hoc, examination. They not only did that right at the end of the diet, your last day dieting, they measured the resting metabolic rate and saw the degree of metabolic adaptation, but they also followed them up and remeasured their resting metabolic rate at 4 weeks post diet, and then at 1 and 2 years post weight loss maintenance. And when they reanalyzed their metabolic rate after they were back in energy balance and eating at maintenance calories, they did not measure any degree of sustained metabolic adaptation. And they also found no association between the degree of metabolic adaptation the women had experienced during the diet and their chance of weight regain within 2 years of finishing the weight loss phase. They also specifically analyzed those in the group had regained the most weight after over the 1 to 2 years post diet, and found that those women had actually experienced less metabolic adaptation. So listen to this. A lot of people associate that metabolic adaptation is a predictor of weight regain. However, the women that gained the most amount of weight actually didn't suffer from the most degree of metabolic adaptation. They actually saw an average drop in resting metabolic rate of 40 calories during weight loss instead of 50 calories. But they had no signs of metabolic adaptation at 1 to 2 years post diet. So it wasn't like those who experienced the greatest metabolic adaptation also experienced the most weight regain. And research like this is really important to be aware of and educate others on, because most people in our industry automatically assume that the larger the degree of metabolic adaptation someone incurs during a diet, the higher the likelihood of weight regain. But in most of the research, we find that those who experience the greatest amount of metabolic adaptation do so not because this is a predictor of weight regain, but because they've lost the greatest amount of weight during a study or during a diet. And this is not predictive of that person's degree of weight regain or their chance of weight regain. So metabolic adaptation isn't the cause of weight regain, but rather it's the results of high degrees of weight loss. As the more weight that we lose and the more weight, essentially the deeper into a diet that you get, the more likely you are to experience down regulations in energy expenditure, especially the subconscious decreases in your NEAT levels. And what Martins and colleagues, research over the last, say, 3 to 4 years has really reinforced is that metabolic adaptation is not a permanent condition where your metabolic rate and your levels of energy expenditure stay suppressed. It's a transient state. So there is no metabolic damage. There is no breaking your metabolism like that. Those things do not exist whatsoever. And so this is a transient and temporary state that only persists during active weight loss and while being in a deficit. However, once you go back to maintenance for a good amount of time, you actually readily feed yourself at a eucaloric balance, at energy balance, these adaptations are reversed because you've removed the root cause for your body adapting, which is being in a deficit where your body looks to conserve energy, and you stop losing weight. So active weight loss is a big component of this, because as you become a lighter person, you now require less energy to partake in all your daily activities. So once we take the two root causes away from metabolic adaptation, there is none. You know what I mean? So yes, it is. There was a paper, and Martins and colleagues did this paper, and the title was something to the degree of metabolic adaptation is an illusion. And a lot of people misinterpreted that. Yes, what they meant by an illusion is it's here today, but it can be gone tomorrow. You know what I mean? A kind of like, in an analogy type of way. But this is something that I think that more people need to be aware of, because I even will have clients come to me, and because I've spoken so often on these topics, they'll say, well, what can I do to avoid metabolic adaptation? Like, what can we do to completely avoid it? And it's like, let's not lose weight. Like, that's the only thing I can tell you. Like, don't go into an energy deficit. Don't lose any body fat. Be happy where you're at. And here's the thing. We shouldn't look to avoid it. We should look to manage and mitigate it. And we should also look at it as it's actually like a predictor of success. Like, if you the greatest degree of metabolic adaptation we have in the literature is the Biggest Loser study. So, those studies, and Kevin Hall did a reanalysis about 2 years ago on this. And initially, they had thought the metabolic suppression that they had experienced after post weight loss essentially was due to them having damaged their metabolism, when really it was because they were still maintaining such a high degree of weight loss. And so a lot of times people will take one little area of the literature, one study, and a finding that needs to be reanalyzed later, and they only take that and they kind of run with it. So they say, this is, we have one study out of all the hundreds of studies on metabolism that we have that say you can have a suppressed metabolism permanently. And it's like, you guys aren't looking at the actual facts. These people lost close to 200 pounds. They did it in a very aggressive manner, and they maintained, especially in a small subset, they had maintained such high degrees of weight loss. They were doing such high levels of activity. We're talking 4 to 6 hours a day of, exercise. Most people, I mean, I'm not even going to say most, 95% of people out there are not doing what they did in this weight loss competition. They didn't have a couple $100,000 on the line. They weren't taking, exogenous drugs to help, really increase energy expenditure and help with increasing metabolic rate during that period, and probably had to get off after. There's so many different factors, and there's so much nuance and context that needs to be taken into consideration when we discuss these topics.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like really the big thing is, again, it's not permanent. And then also it's kind of a good thing that if you do see some metabolic adaptation, because that's a sign that you are, probably dropping weight if that's your goal, right? I feel like it's sort of like hunger. It's one of those things where, you don't want to be super
100%.
hungry, but at the same time, if you're never hungry, are you actually like dropping body fat? So it's like one of those things, again, it's not great, but also at the same time, it's a good sign that things are heading in the right direction. So you kind of hit on like the rebound effect on the way down. Again, same type of thing there, just probably not necessarily something that's going to be detrimental, but more so just kind of like something that you just kind of have to work around there on that. Is there anything, I know you said, obviously we can't not get any of it, but you mentioned mitigating it. Is there anything specific there with that you really try to focus on to try to mitigate it as best as you can?
Yeah, honestly, there are two things that really exacerbate, so amplify metabolic adaptation. So it is the degree of weight loss that you sustain, or that you essentially achieve during a weight loss phase. So that's the first component. And then it's the degree of the deficit used. And so we kind of have depth and duration of the deficit, in terms of how deep do you go into a deficit, as well as how long is that fat loss phase, as well as we have how much total weight loss do you lose. So there's multiple things that we could do. I like kind of doing a phasic approach to fat loss, where I don't want to say ever. Let me say this. On average, I will not take a client over 10% of body weight loss in a singular fat loss phase. If someone comes to me, and I've had this many of times, I had a particular client, we are now having maintained, I believe it's over 55 pounds. I know that for a fact. I want to say it's like 58 pounds of sustained weight loss. During his first fat loss phase, he started at 200 pounds, and I brought him down, about 21 pounds. So it was right over that 10%. And the reason for that is because a lot of times when we do actually look in the literature on metabolic adaptation, we see over 10% is when, I don't want to say things go awry. You won't see a continual decrease in your resting metabolic rate, but you will see a precipitous decrease in your NEAT levels. And I just think over 10%, that's a substantial amount of body weight, where it really, if someone came to me, they only had 12%, we would do it in one shot. However,
Right.
we're already 16 to 18 weeks into a diet to really get off. And really, when you think about this individual, we ended up losing about 25% of his body weight at this point. And so within that would not be sustainable or even realistic to approach in one fat loss phase. So essentially how I did it was I put him through one, long fat loss phase. We lost 10 or 11% of his body weight. Then from there, we went into a maintenance phase for 12 weeks. And I really just wanted him to learn how to live at maintenance and really be able to ingrain these patterns and these habits of being able to not go through extremes, because this was someone that had come to me from a background of either crash dieting, very quickly. So he would lose 20. So we lost 21 pounds in that first fat loss phase, and it was slow. It was about 1.5 pounds per week at the most. And whereas in the past, he could lose 20 pounds in less than 10 weeks, but he always regained it and more. And so, really what I did was I tried to keep him within a maintenance range of 2 to 3% of his body weight. So initially we got down to 180 pounds. And this is a couple years ago. We've been working together at least 2 years at this point. So we got down to 180 pounds, and he stayed between about 182 once we had reloaded glycogen and stuff. He had increased carbohydrates. He stayed between around 182 and 187 pounds. So it was about a 5-pound maintenance range, and that was more than appropriate. And so then in our subsequent fat loss phase, we lost another 10% of body weight, which was around 18 to 19 pounds. And really in our last fat loss phase, which is, it's been quite some time since we've done that, it was literally just like a 7% weight loss that we needed. So each one got less extreme. And multiple reasons for that, but one of the reasons for that is to mitigate metabolic adaptation, especially from like even just a behavioral perspective. So just things that we notice within metabolic adaptation, it's not just the down regulations and energy expenditure and also like your NEAT levels, so you become more sluggish as the fat loss phase goes on, but also perturbations in your hormone levels, and then also the food focus and the hunger that comes along with it. So it's really being able to manage that and kind of like walk a tightrope between getting to your goals in the most optimal manner possible, and then also doing so in a practical manner where we're not trying to take off, we at this point we've taken off 55 pounds off this person's frame. But if I had tried to approach that in that first fat loss phase, it wouldn't have been conducive for his long term, not only for his health within that short, within, say we did that in a year period of time, wouldn't have been conducive for him in that perspective, but also from a habits perspective, I would have never been able to teach him how to live at maintenance. And now he's able to sustain 55 pounds loss when he was that person that would do an 8 to 10 week fat loss phase, lose 20 pounds, regain 25, never maintained it in a day in his phase in his life. And now he's been 8+ months living 55 pounds leaner than he was 2 years ago when he came to me. So that's one way we can mitigate metabolic adaptation. We can utilize different phasic strategies, but probably the biggest thing that I utilize is a less aggressive rate of loss. And so that is just to not exacerbate the energy deficit and really put someone into a much larger degree of, I guess, calorie restriction than necessary, which are only going to amplify some of those biofeedback, signals essentially. So the hunger, the lack of sleep, feeling poor, and then also having like the really decrease in energy levels that are only going to exacerbate the decrease in NEAT, which is going to, very dramatically affect your energy expenditure levels.
Yeah, a couple things on that. I think a lot of people don't realize how big of a change you have to make when you drop 10% or more of your body weight in general, right? Like from a lifestyle perspective, the more you have to lose, the create like the bigger that is, that lifestyle changes. And then same thing too, that 10% body weight, for whatever reason, that seems to kind of be that area right there where things do start to really slow down. And so it's like, when you get to that 10%, again, like you said, maybe it's not exactly 10%, but that's usually around that range, give or take a little bit from person to person, where it's like, all right, now we need to move out of this and potentially, like you said, go to maintenance and learn how to live there. And like you said, maintain those habits that, again, are crucial long-term. So cool. Is there anything else on metabolic adaptation or metabolism in general that you wanted to touch on before we dive into the body recomposition stuff? All good. Cool. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the next one. I know you said you kind of had evolving views on rate of loss and size of deficit during fat loss phases, and I guess let's hit on the body recomposition one. I don't know if those tie in together or not, but I'm going to kind of let you take that, how you want to handle either one of those there with that.
All right. You want me to go through body recomp, or would you want me to go through the rate of loss?
Let's do body recomp.
All right. All right. So when it comes to body recomp, we had spoken about this off air. This is something I've definitely changed my views on or evolved my thoughts on, essentially. And so, this is the one area of body recomposition that I've really evolved my thoughts on within the last few years. And really what I've evolved my thoughts on is the possibility and the likelihood of body recomposition, as this is something I've been able to achieve more and more over the years with clients I've worked with. And that's due to multiple reasons. So first and foremost, I've evolved as a coach. So even my own practices have evolved, and I've gotten better at nutrition training and lifestyle programming. But even more so, the client population I work with nowadays is far different than I did at the start of my coaching journey. So, if we go back to when I've originally started coaching, it's 2013, and I was heavily involved in the bodybuilding industry as I was actively competing. So from around 2013 to 2018 or so, I mostly worked with very advanced trainees and or physique competitors. So if you had asked me, like say we go back to 2015, and you had asked me about body recomposition, if I thought it was attainable in advanced athletes, I would have probably told you it was unlikely. But that would have been most heavily influenced and kind of clouded by what I was seeing in my own coaching practices. However, starting around like 2019, my coaching roster went from being predominantly made up of advanced male physique clients to me working with more and more lifestyle clients and women. And since then, I've been able to achieve body weight composition more and more frequently with the clients I work with. So at this point, I believe that the vast majority of individuals can experience and can achieve some degree of body recomposition. Now, keep in mind, I'm saying some degree, meaning some can really experience a very significant degree of body recomposition. Some can experience a small degree, but I do believe that the vast majority of individuals can experience some sort of body recomposition. And another thing I think many fail to realize is that body recomposition can occur in multiple forms. So most people think about body recomposition as the act of losing fat and gaining muscle simultaneously, which is the most popular form of body recomposition. However, we can also achieve recomposition in two other ways. So if you lose a significant amount of body fat and maintain all your muscle mass, you've achieved body recomposition as your muscle mass to fat mass ratio has improved. And also, a secondary thing, if you are to build muscle mass while maintaining your current level of fat mass, you've also recomped, as now you carry more lean mass, yet the same amount of fat mass, which actually decreases your total body fat percentage. So I think that the majority of trainees that we see in the gym can achieve one of these three forms of body recomposition, as body recomp can technically occur in a recomp phase, but it can also occur in a fat loss phase or in a lean building phase if done correctly. So my views on this topic have evolved not only due to seeing body recomposition occur time and time again with the clients that I work with, but also we've had more and more research come out on this topic over the last few years. So the body of evidence we have on body recomposition is far stronger than it was when I first started coaching over a decade ago. And we're very, at that time, very few people were even talking about this concept because many were under the impression that it was so unlikely or it only happened in untrained individuals or only happened in obese individuals that it almost like for us coaches, those were generally not the people we were working with most often. So it was almost like kind of discarded from even being part of like the regular nomenclature of conversations that we would have. But really, if we look into literature on the last couple of years, we've had an immense amount of research come out on this. So, for example, in 2020, there was a review released by Barakat and colleagues, which looked at whether trained individuals can recomp. And much of the evidence they presented showed that there are many cases in which resistant trained individuals recomp, especially when they combine a progressive training stimulus with evidence based nutrition and lifestyle strategies, such as following a high protein diet, utilizing nutrient timing, having proper stress management, and incorporating better sleep hygiene. And I think many think that they're more advanced than they are just due to the fact they've been training for a while. So I commonly find this in the gym or even in my own consultations where people tell me, yeah, I'm an advanced trainee. And they kind of just base that not off of strength standards, not off of their actual body, progression or where they've, started and where they've came from, but mostly because of how many years they've been actually, pretty much just signed up to a gym. So pretty much just paying the gym membership. They're like, yeah, I've been in the gym 5+ years. I'm advanced. However, if you have yet to optimize everything from your nutrition to your training to your lifestyle design, you most likely have more growth potential and there's gains that are being left on the table currently. So just because you've been training for years does not mean you've maxed out your potential. And there are so many variables that can be improved upon and will yield better results. So when a new client comes to me, I'm always looking at what they are currently doing and what we can improve upon. So I'm always looking not only at their current, approach, but also what are the bottlenecks holding them back from making true the most progress possible. And a lot of times I find that these individuals are able to recomp to some degree when we really dial things in from whether it be, and we have to look at different bottlenecks. So bottleneck for one person, they might be killing themselves in the gym, but their nutrition is lacking from a nutrient timing perspective, from a protein distribution perspective, from a total calorie perspective. It could be so many things, micronutrient intake. Or we can have other people that have really poor stress management. So they're stressed to the gills and they're really neglecting that. And they only think that their gains are made by what they do in the gym or what they do in the kitchen. So there's so many different levers that we can pull. There's so many different areas within someone's lifestyle or their programming that we as coaches have an ability to influence and really impact them in a positive manner. That honestly, I find that almost every client that I work with at this point, besides like my very advanced, male bodybuilding competitors, can recomp to some degree. So often I'll put them into a primer phase when they first come to me. That's the first initial phase that we work through. And even if I just put them at maintenance or just in a very slight deficit, we're able to see some degree of body recomposition. With women, I generally find it to be a much more significant degree. Like some of these women morph, whereas some guys, it's like, all right, they lost a significant amount of body fat. They maintained all their lean mass. They're in a better state physiologically and psychologically for the next phase. And now we're able to accrue more lean mass and not due to like having gotten leaner, but just because they have better habits in place. They've been able to focus more on a progressive training stimulus, really getting locked in the gym and really going to a true 0 reps in reserve. So they've kind of recalibrated their perception of relative intensity. We've gotten their volume dialed in. There's so many different parameters that we can work on, even their exercise execution or exercise selection. And so these are almost like dominoes that we can just stack up together. And when one falls over, it knocks the whole bunch over. And it's like that compounding interest. We're picking up 1% gains. Nutrient timing might be 1%, protein distribution might be another percent. You know, different supplementation, creatine supplementation. Long muscle length training another percent. But all of a sudden we have 10 different things and we just increase that person's ability to gain muscle by 10%. So it's like picking up those little 1% and really combining them into a synergistic approach. And another thing about this is really taking a periodized approach to both training and nutrition to elicit body recomposition. And a lot of times that's really beneficial because they have a synergistic effect. So it's not just a 1 + 1 = 2, it's like a 1 + 1 = 3. And so this is where I really have evolved my thoughts. And this has come not only due to literature, but it's also because I've changed who I'm working with. So the reason I wasn't seeing this is because I worked with many individuals that were in their 30s. They'd already been competing for years. And I was working with such advanced individuals that it almost clouded my judgment in being able to say, are people really recomping? And it's kind of funny. I was thinking about this topic before I got on, and I kind of like, I guess like we only see what's in front of us. And I've been lucky that I've never niched myself down, and I've worked with all different demographics from, Lifestyle Lisa and Gem Pop Gym to IFBB pros that have been on the Olympia level. So I've seen everything and anything. And that's really allowed me to be more open-minded to this, because I will say during the first 5 years, I was very niche down. And it wasn't that I didn't work with lifestyle clients, but it was like I was working with people that were hobby builders. So they were still serious. They might have not been competitors, but they still had many years in the gym. So I was worked with more advanced individuals. And it wasn't until about 5 years into my career where I was like really starting to pick up more lifestyle clients. And it was like people I was meeting at work, or I would be at different events within my corporate job, where people were like, I walked the walk, I was a competitor myself. I had to look, and they were like, I want to know what you're doing. And then I worked with people that, yes, they had been into a gym for 5-10 years, but really they had never maximized things. It was never a priority to them. And when I got them to really embrace the whole a healthy body is a responsive body and really improve upon their health and their fitness, we primed their body. And that's really when I started formulating that primer phase and really getting into it. I started utilizing like a higher flux model, which was really just a steps progression at that time, because I didn't even have the flux, that term had not even come into literature. All these things kind of created this perfect storm, this perfect recipe, where I was able to see body recomposition far more frequently in the last 5 years of my career than I did in the first 5 years.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. I think the big thing, like you said, is that most people come in and they've never maximized all aspects of it, right? There's always at least a couple things I feel like you can really dial in, whether that be, again, a lifestyle perspective, a nutrition, or maybe even training, right? It's like maybe they are training, but it's like no really structured, like you said, or anything like that. And it can be geared more towards, I'm assuming hypertrophy style training is kind of what you're talking about there with that. There's a lot of areas where they can improve there on that. What I also like about what you said is it's not also just necessarily fat loss and muscle gain at the same time. We can kind of break this down into other aspects where it's like, hey, you can also build muscle while maintaining fat mass, and in turn you decrease your body fat percentage. And then same thing, which it kind of sounds like, maybe I think the third one was fat loss while maintaining muscle as well too, correct? Is that kind of, did you lump that in there as well?
The three forms of body recomposition, we have the prototypical body recomposition, which is the building muscle while simultaneously losing fat. We have a secondary form, which could happen during a fat loss phase, which is where you lose a significant amount of body fat, but you maintain all your lean mass. So you're not losing just weight, you're really losing predominantly body fat. So now your level lean mass is the same, but your level fat mass is significantly less. So now that muscle mass to fat mass ratio is skewed more in the muscle mass perspective. And then we have the ability to recomp during a lean building phase. So say I put you in a slight surplus, Jeff, and we only accrue lean tissue. You don't get any more fat mass. You have the same amount of fat percentage or body fat mass on your body at the beginning of a building phase as you do at the end. However, you have gained 5 pounds. You're advanced. So I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. We're going to go 5 pounds of lean mass. But say we had someone that's much newer, it might be 10 pounds of lean mass. So say you gain 10 pounds of lean mass. Well, if you take that and you actually look at your your lean mass, your body weight, and then your fat mass, you will actually have decreased body fat. So, I recently had an example. I was working through with a client. I believe they were 150 pounds. They were 20% body fat. So that would be 30 pounds of fat mass. And so say that a person had 30 pounds of fat mass and they maintain that 30 pounds of fat mass. And now we increased their body weight by 10 pounds, but it was purely through lean mass. So now they're a 160-pound individual that used to be 20% body fat with 30 pounds of lean mass, but now we got to do 160 divided by 30. So that should come out to approximately like 18.5%. So they've lost 1.5% of body fat. They haven't lost any fat mass, but they've increased their lean mass. So by proxy, that has decreased their body fat percentage. So now, technically, first of all, muscle is going to make you look leaner. You're going to be shapelier. If it's a woman, you're going to be more toned. You're going to have better shape to your body. If you're a man, you're going to be more muscular, fuller, rounder. But you've improved your body composition by doing so. So that is technically body recomposition.
Yeah, yeah, no, I love that. Again, it's not necessarily always just dropping weight or dropping body fat. Again, it could be add a muscle, and that in turn is going to change that body fat percentage. Do you find out of these three? Do you find any of them to be most popular or most common or the easiest for people to achieve?
Yeah, so it's definitely going to be based on where they're starting at. So, for instance, the most popular, without a doubt, is the typical body recomposition. So everyone wants to build muscle while losing fat. I generally see that to be most common in newer trainees. I see that in obese populations or people with excess adiposity, essentially, or I'll see that in untrained, like someone that has, and what I mean, or not untrained, I mean detrained. So a lot of times when we talk about detrained, a lot of people anticipate or actually, often assume that means that someone's just been completely out of the gym. But I've had a lot of individuals with, these are people that spent a decade in the gym and then they really had to go to a really like minimum effective dose. So this is someone that used to train 5-6 days per week. Now they have a family, they just had a baby, and I've had this with clients where we've backed things off to like 2 days per week and it hasn't been a priority, or they've just had another, focus. So for instance, this isn't the case with Brian Borstein, but I've had clients like Brian where they've gotten a focus in something else. They've really gotten into, I had someone that really liked to do Spartan races. So like those adventure courses and stuff. And so that was his priority. So I fueled him nutrition wise, but we did a very bare basics, in terms of very minimal effective dose training for hypertrophy training. It was just a 2-day split. It was an upper body session, a lower body session. He recomped when we got back into training, 4 to 5 times per week in a progressive manner, utilizing higher volumes, higher frequency, and higher intensities on those, his entire musculature. And he almost got like a muscle memory effect. So the muscle he had lost during a different focus, he was able to regain quicker, and he didn't gain fat mass in the process. So there's those type of people that can really do the simultaneous body recomposition. Then when it comes to losing fat and maintaining muscle, I believe everyone can do that. So that's anyone that enters a fat loss phase. That's often really my main focus. And I especially see that with women. And the reason for that is because they have a higher body fat percentage at the start of a fat loss phase. And then also a lot of times they have taken such an aggressive form of dieting in the past that they are primed in a state where their body is so used to being underfueled that if you're giving them, or if you put them at a slight deficit, they're much more likely to be able to recomp in the process. And then from like a lean mass perspective, I find that a lot of people that have yet to dial in hypertrophy training specifically. So I'll give you an example. I've had many individuals that they're D1 athletes. They have played college football or they're CrossFitters. They're well-trained individuals. They've trained hard, they've trained intensely, but it's never been hypertrophy specific, or it's never been bodybuilding specific, or they've tacked on some, bicep curls at the end of a strength training workout, but it's a different stimulus that they're going for. The rep ranges are different, even the amount of volume that they use, or even their ability to execute movements. A lot of times, they're just trying to move, a bench press or whatever it may be, a movement from point A to point B, rather than really trying to place, realizing that it isn't a load that the muscle knows, it's mechanical tension, really trying to place that tension stimulus on a target musculature. So I've seen that be the case where, especially in a lean building phase, I'm able to help those individuals stay at the same body fat percentage, because some of them are relatively lean. I've had many CrossFitters that they come to me and they're in really good shape. However, they're in great aerobic shape, great cardiovascular respiratory fitness shape, and there are weight trained experience, but it's been more in this glycolytic work. It's very a circuit style, not proper rest periods. So they've kind of had a limiting factor. They've essentially had their own interference effect. And I don't mean that just from the cardio perspective, but if you actually think about it from like a rest period perspective, we actually see in the literature that when you take shorter rest periods, it not only blunts the hypertrophic response per set. So if we look at, Brad Schoenfeld has a great study looking at 3-minute rest intervals versus 1-minute rest intervals. And in all the body parts studied, I think it was quadriceps, biceps, and triceps, We saw greater growth in the 3 sets group. There's another study that looks at just the mechanistic aspect of this. What is the protein synthetic response to longer rest intervals of 3 minutes compared to shorter rest intervals of 1 minute? And we see a blunting of the actual muscle protein synthetic response to shorter rest intervals. So you're getting less bang for your buck, essentially. And so sometimes I think that a lot of individuals that have taken either a CrossFit perspective, a boot camp perspective, or boot camp type of background, those type of modalities to training, they've put a limiter on their ability to actually accrue as much muscle as they could if they took proper rest periods, if they really pushed progressive overload, if they had a more periodized training program. So for instance, they haven't been utilizing any progression method. So as soon as I start integrating something phasic, like a double progression method, and we're going up in load or reps over time, it's a new stimulus to their body. It's challenging them and presenting them from something other than a cardiovascular perspective. So now they're not cardio limited or aerobically limited, and that becoming the cause of failure. They're actually failing from the target musculature.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I think that's awesome that even, people that have been training for a while can continue to do that. I know you wanted to hit on women and body recomposition. Was there anything that you wanted to touch there? I know you kind of briefly touched on women a little bit, but I know we're kind of running short on time here. So I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that if you have time.
My friend. We're going to be able to get both because I had texted my client that I'll be a little bit late. So we got 15 minutes. So we'll go through both, but
Sweet.
We'll start with the women and body recomposition. So reason, and we had spoken off air about this, this is something that I'm seeing more and more in practice, and especially over the last few years. And I've seen that the women that I work with tend to have a greater ability to recomp than many of the men that I've encountered or that I work with. And I have to put the caveat in there that often a lot of the men that I work with are very advanced. So I still get a lot of bodybuilder or former bodybuilders. So that is skewing my population sample. But I will say that even in literature, and we can go through some of this, we are seeing a little bit of a predisposition towards some women. And I don't think people are really teasing that out because maybe they're not digging into the real study details as much. But I personally, and I've looked through the literature on this, I think this is due to several reasons, including the fact that women generally have higher body fat levels, especially at the start of a phase. So at the beginning of any phase, they're going to have higher body fat than a male does. And we know that body fat is one of the biggest influencers as to whether you can or cannot recomp or to the degree to which you can recomp, because that's essentially a reservoir of energy that you can utilize even when being in a deficit. They're usually not as experienced with hypertrophy training or as well trained as males are. They often have a history of using aggressive calorie deficits like we discussed in the past. So when I use a more moderate deficit with them, they not only feel better and perform better, but they're also able to build muscle in a deficit, because you have to think about it from a comparative analysis. If someone's been slashing their calories by 50% and I put them in a slight deficit of 10%, that is a massive increase in energy availability as compared to what their body is used to previously. And they're often also more likely to undereat protein. So when I dial in their total protein intake, their protein distribution, and nutrient timing, they're in a more conducive state to grow lean tissue. And even if we look at some of the differences in a female client's physiology as compared to a male client's physiology, we see that females naturally use more fat for fuel, yet less protein. So they have more of a protein-sparing metabolism, and they also have higher body fat levels. So even if a female and male are at the same level of, say, relative leanness, a female will have a higher amount of body fat due to the differences in essential body fat levels. And this higher body fat percentage leaves them less likely to oxidize or break down muscle tissue and amino acids for energy, and more likely to utilize fat for energy during a deficit. So many times I find that many of my female clients will recomp even during a fat loss phase, meaning they're losing body fat while gaining muscle, which slows down their scale weight. And many times I have to explain this to them. And I really want to go through this because this is a conversation I often have. And a lot of times I'll have a female client and she's recomping, and it's visible through pictures, through caliper readings, through waist circumference, things of that sort. And she interprets the fact that there's a slowing in weight loss to mean that they're not losing fat, when it actually could be just be an indication that they're recomping. So for example, if a female client loses a pound of fat tissue while gaining a pound of muscle tissue, their scale weight would stay exactly the same, despite having lost a pound of fat and improving their body composition, which is something that can often throw them for a loop at first, as many women are very scale weight focused. But I often find that they're able to end a fat loss phase in a far leaner and more muscular state than they ended previous diets at, due to the approach that we've taken. So although they may not hit, and this is something I often have to explain to my clients, you may not hit your target, X, amount of pounds. Often women will say, I want to be 130 pounds. That's something that was kind of just ingrained in their culture, and they kind of just have it as a target. But often we don't hit that. If someone started at 160 pounds, we may not hit 130 pounds. And to me, that's an arbitrary number. You just kind of pulled that, you plucked it out of thin air. You got that from what you weighed in high school, whatever it may be, or what you hear your friends weighing. And we have to realize that everyone has different anthropometrics, different genetics, things of that sort. bone density. There's so many things that come into body weight. However, oftentimes they don't get to the weight that they wanted, but they're far leaner and have a much better body composition than they even anticipated. So we have to realize we have to kind of throw away the scale in terms of being the end all be all metric of tracking progress. And then when we actually look into more research on this topic, it's really interesting is when we actually look at bodybuilding case studies, we see that getting into contest shape. And this is something you'll hear many individuals, especially from the bodybuilding industry, they'll talk about is we often see a loss in lean mass. And we have papers that look at large cohorts of female competitors and see that they often retain all their lean mass or even some advanced trainees in these cohorts. So these are contest prep competitors. These are female physique competitors. They actually gain muscle during a prep. So, for example, there was a 2017 study by Homey et al., which is probably the best example of this. And they looked at a cohort of female competitors that ranged, it was like female physique competitors, there was figure competitors, bikini competitors. So it was a range of different female physique athletes. And what they found was the vast majority of female competitors retained all their lean mass while losing a significant amount of body fat. We're talking about getting to almost essential levels of body fat for females. But if you actually look at the actual data plot, like the forest plot, and you look at the individual data points in the study, there were several female competitors who lost a substantial amount of fat, got into contest shape, but also gained muscle during a contest prep. So even in women getting very lean, they do have the ability to recomp if they approach their diet, their training, their sleep, and their stress in the right way. So seeing as the vast majority of females that I work with are lifestyle clients, not competitors, I've seen that these individuals are far more likely to achieve body recomposition as they have higher body fat percentages to begin with, which influences our ability to recomp. They're not getting as lean as female competitors or as males are getting. And so they have a much greater likelihood to be able to gain muscle during a deficit. And many of them have not been following a progressive resistance training program. And what I personally get is a lot of individuals that have come to me, and they've spent years training, but they're doing a ton of HIIT cardio or they're doing boot camp classes. And these are just not optimized for muscle growth. And the other ancillary factor that really comes into play, especially with the population that I work with, is I work with a lot of women that have a history of chronic dieting. They have many diets under their belt. And so essentially they've been in a state where they've been underfueling themselves for years. And so a lot of them have trained fasted. They haven't dialed in their nutrient timing. There are so many things that we can dial in. And it's not just from the physical perspective. Yes, I have to put a plan on paper. And, I'm working in, making sure that they have a proper pre-workout meal. I'm making sure we have nutrient timing, that we're spacing out their meals correctly so they don't have large gaps in energy availability throughout the day. It's not only that, though. It's really encouraging these women. It's really speaking with them and helping them with their relationship with food so they embrace eating more to be able to facilitate better progress in the gym and really looking at it as I'm fueling myself to be able to function better, to feel better. And eventually their body composition responds as a result. And they also don't have that essentially stress response to eating more like a lot of women do, which only exacerbates some of the cortisol elevations, the insulin resistant things of that sort. So we're working on all factors. So once I dial in all areas of their program, I often find women to recomp to the greatest degree. So it's not that I'm saying that men, it's only women that recomp. I'm just saying in my own personal experience, I see this in literature as well. We see that women have or I'll just say in my personal experience, I've seen that women have a greater degree of body recomposition. So it's more significant, especially when we do like a comparative analysis between their starting photos and their ending photos.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are all great points. I mean, the higher body fat levels, that makes sense. Again, like you said, they need to have a little bit more essential body fat than we do, than men do. I think the other one too was they're less likely to use protein as a fuel source as well. Absolutely. Too, correct? You said the fat, they're going to oxidize fat more so than like.
Yeah, due to the role that estrogen plays, they have more of an oxidative metabolism. So even if you look at like differences in mitochondrial content, we see that women have more enzymes to upregulate fat use, especially intramuscular triglyceride use, than males do.
And then even the experience of training, right? The way that they've trained too. I mean, that's definitely, again, probably a massive generalization there, but a lot of times I see the same thing, when women come to me as well too, with that under eating protein. So all those things are going to add up, like you said. So what about like on the way up? So let's say they're, maybe they're not in a fat loss phase. To you, does this tell you that maybe they don't need as much of a surplus as well? Or can you not extrapolate those two together based off of that?
So I wouldn't say because they have a better ability to recomp that they would need a smaller surplus. However, I will say that if we actually look in the literature, and there's very limited on this, there's a study by Levine that looked at overfeeding studies. And if you actually go into it's a massive paper. If you actually go into the individual subject, you'll actually see that the people or the individuals within that overfeeding study was 1,000 calories per day for 8 weeks. One person upregulated their energy expenditure by over 700 calories. So essentially, that 1,000 calorie surplus became less than a 300 calorie surplus per day. those who upregulated meat the least were actually female participants. There was very few in the study, but I will say that most of what we have in the literature shows that women are more likely to have, I don't want to say more likely, they have less of an increase in energy expenditure due to increases in energy intake. So within that, and that could just be a conservative mechanism, just like from a survival perspective. And so we see that they have higher essential body fat levels, and also their ability to gain is going, they can gain just as much muscle as men in a relative basis, meaning, it's not going to be
Right.
absolute. Absolute would mean total pounds of tissue. In a relative basis, women have the same muscular potential as men, but we have to keep in mind they're much smaller. They weigh a lot less. So if we're looking at a rate of gain, we got to use a percentage. So really with women, I'm only aiming, especially advanced women that I work with, only for 0.25% per week, which really equates to about 1% of body weight gain per month. But keep in mind, if a woman is, so if I did 1% and it's someone, my size or greater, if I have a 200-pound male and we're gaining at 1% per month, he's advanced, that's 2 pounds per month. You know what I mean? But with a female, if they're 110 pounds, that's 1 pound. So it's a
Right.
much smaller surplus that we'll be utilizing. And I'm more of a fan of very slight surpluses to begin with. So I would utilize almost irregardless a smaller surplus, and we could titrate based off of that individual female client's response to increases in calories. But I would rather play it safe and utilize a little bit less aggressive of a surplus rather than putting them in a massive surplus. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is it's not only the physiological impact of that they could be just gaining weight at a more rapid rate than they can actually accrue lean tissue, but also just seeing their scale weight go up and things of that sort. It could really impact them from a mental perspective. And I think that's why a lot of women don't have successful building phases, because as they see their scale weight go up, maybe a coach takes them a little bit too quickly and they want to backtrack and they want to backpedal and automatically go back into a deficit. And really that's not conducive. So I really like walking them up in a strategic and titrated approach.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense there on that. And really interesting on the not the neat expenditure increase as well too. So I had one question, but I didn't know if there was anything else that you specifically wanted to go over regarding women and body recomposition.
You know what? The one thing that we could tie in would be my rate of loss differences in women than we would in men, because that is going to also impact their ability to recomp. So this is something we actually meant to speak about on the last podcast, but this is one area that I've really evolved my thoughts on, which is the weekly rate of loss that I use with my female clients. And that's come from a combination of multiple things. So it's come from working with more female clients over the last couple of years. And then also the fact that I'm working with more and more women who have come to me with a history of chronic dieting and also getting more and more into the reds and the low energy availability literature. So more than a year and a half ago, we had recorded a mini cut podcast, and I listened back to it recently, actually. And even back then, I had went over how if a client has a poor relationship with food or a history of chronic dieting, or hadn't had success, like several successful fat loss phases under their belt, where they had been able to lose fat and maintain the vast majority of that weight, I wouldn't advise them using a mini cut. So I had made many caveats within that podcast, and I always try to be very specific and get into nuances. And I also specifically outlined how the approach I use with female clients during a mini cut is a slower one than I use. And essentially, I use a less aggressive or less assertive deficit than I use with my males. And back then, I had actually said, and I wrote this down to make sure that I quoted myself correctly. I said with women that I would use a 6 to 8 week mini cut, whereas compared to males, I would utilize generally a 3 to 6 week mini cut. And although I will still do that in very specific cases with women that I've worked with for years and have been in a state of optimal energy availability for a prolonged period of time and haven't dieted in like a substantial period of time, I'll be honest, one of the biggest things I've evolved my thoughts, my views, and even my coaching practices and approach on is I tend to employ mini cuts far less frequently with women now than I did in the past. And this is not to say that there's never a case to use a short assertive diet with a female, but based on the female clientele I've been working with the past year and a half since we originally recorded that podcast, I just don't think it's an appropriate tool for many of the women that I work with currently, as many of them have come to me having had a long history of crash dieting and have suffered from the effects of relative energy deficiency, which is essentially a condition that stems from a prolonged period of low energy availability, which is caused by under eating and under fueling and over exercising for chronic periods of time. So the issue with being in the state of low energy availability and potentially, developing REDs is that it causes a ton of downstream cascades and consequences on our physiology. So specifically with women, we see decreases in menstrual cycle function. We see decreases in bone mineral density. We see decreases in sex hormone production, impairments in immunity, and decreases in training performance, which is going to impact their ability to not only build muscle, but also maintain it. And here's the thing. Men can technically reach a state of low energy availability in reds, but it's far more common in women who are more susceptible to the physiological effects of low energy availability. So much of the research we have on reds is looking at the effects of long, like prolonged periods of being in low energy availability. So we're talking about months and years on end of essentially underfueling yourself and overexercising. But just this past year, we had a study come out that looked at the effects of a short period of low energy availability via low calorie diet and the effects that it had on muscle protein synthesis rates, lean mass, and a female's response to a progressive resistance training program combined with sufficient protein intake. So this was one study that I was already evolving my thoughts based on just all the clientele that I worked with. I just saw that it wasn't an efficacious approach. But this kind of, I don't want to say this put the nail in the coffin, but this was a really impactful study in my clinical perspective as an actual coach and someone that works with people in the real world. So in this study, essentially what they did was they took a group of healthy resistance trained women who were naturally cycling. So they were all their health markers were in line, and they put them on a baseline diet that was at, optimal energy availability. And I want to say it was like 6 or 7 days that they kept them at a sufficient amount of calorie intake. So they had more than enough energy on board. And then after this period of being at the baseline diet, they split them into two groups. So they had an optimal energy availability group and then a low energy availability group. So the optimal energy availability group stayed at the baseline calorie intake that they started at, whereas the low energy availability group were put into around a 45% deficit for that 10-day period. So significant deficit. Now, although calorie intakes and energy availability differed, what they did do was they tried to match other, parameters within the study. So they had each participant eat, regardless of the energy intake that they were at, regardless of the group, they had 2.2 grams of protein per day. So it was optimized in terms of muscle building capacity. And they also followed a supervised hypertrophy training program. And so we actually look at the results of these. This is what really kind of like maybe take a step back and said, all right, you know what? When we look at prolonged periods, I definitely don't want a woman in an assertive deficit because we just see the effects from low energy availability research. But even short periods, this is kind of what refamed or evolved my thoughts on mini cuts, because after just a 10-day period of being in an aggressive deficit, the low energy availability group had lost lean mass. They saw significant decreases in muscle protein synthesis rates, saw a significant reduction in their metabolic rate, and it had significant reduction in thyroid production. And this was specifically their T3 levels, which is our metabolically active thyroid hormone. And then on the other hand, when we look at the optimal energy availability group, we see exactly opposite results. So the women that were fed at optimal energy availability actually recomped. So they gained lean mass and they lost a bit of body fat. And this was from following the same exact training program and eating sufficient, protein intake. So we see that the biggest difference was energy availability as to why these results were different. So, I will give the caveat that this was just one study. However, it was extremely well controlled as they gave participants all their meals. They supervised all their training sessions, both in terms of their hypertrophy sessions, but also their cardio sessions. And they used a ton of different measurement methods, including muscle biopsy, DEXA. They had blood and urine samples. I mean, these guys, this had to be an extremely expensive study because it was extremely extensive. So basically, this just provided me with further information reinforcement to refine my methods and approaches. And based off what the literature shows and also the downregulations I've seen in sex hormone profiles, as well as a negative biofeedback that I've seen with new female clients who have come to me after crash dieting with another coach or even on their own, and what I've seen in terms of how long it takes. Because a lot of times women will come to me and they want essentially to go to health phase. I'm trying to restore their menstrual cycle. So it's menstrual cycle recovery essentially. And so a lot of times when I have someone that has done this to themselves in the past or has experienced this, they've been in a state of reds, they've lost their cycle, they have, hypothalamic amenorrhea. A lot of times, the more drastic it's been, the longer it takes. And there's so much time and effort that goes into restoring their menstrual cycle, improving their sex hormone profile, getting their thyroid production back online, that it's definitely made me more cautious and calculated with the approach that I take to helping female clients lose body fat. And these days, I much prefer to use a very conservative weekly rate of loss of between 0.25 and 1% rate of loss per week, which allows me to use a smaller deficit with these women and mitigate low energy availability in the process. So that's one area that I've really changed my thoughts. Like when we had spoken about, mini cuts, it was utilizing a more assertive deficit. It was a larger weekly rate of loss target. And so this is just something that I still think it can be appropriate in certain instances with males. And then also with females that I've worked with for years, I know I get their blood, their blood work before we go into the phase. It's going to be a short period. It's not going to be at a 45% calorie deficit by any means, but it's just kind of it's given me further reinforcement to be like, listen, in my population, this just isn't an appropriate tool. And I really try to, and I think you know this about me, I really try to be nuanced with a lot of the topics that I hit on. I'm very, I cover such a wide array of clientele, and I try to speak to everyone. And sometimes it's very hard to do so, but I always want to make sure the information that I put out is as helpful as possible, but also it represents what I do in practice. And this is something I'll be honest with you, I utilize mini cuts quite frequently in years past. And it's never that I had like a very a bad experience with a female client that you utilize a mini cut with, but it's just the fact that as my clientele has changed and my roster has evolved, it's like, listen, just because I had women that had very little dieting history 3 or 4 years ago when I utilized mini cuts and they were in a perfect state to go into a deficit, doesn't mean that I can utilize those same approaches and those same tactics and strategies with women with a completely different background. So we always have to treat every single client as an N of one. We have to really take into consideration where they are now, but also where they've been. And so it's really, coaching is about individualizing things, and that's why this is our profession, and that's why people come to us. So I'm a big thing about this, and I'm really glad that you came to me with this topic, is because we all should be evolving. Because if you're doing the exact same things that you were doing 3-5 years ago, you probably haven't gotten any better as a coach, because it really takes being open-minded. And it's kind of like the Bruce Lee mentality, which is something I pride myself on having. It's taking in what's useful and discarding what's useless. So there's so much information on the internet, both good and bad. We have quality information, and then misinformation and disinformation. And it's really being able to separate how fact from fiction, the information from misinformation, and being able to really delineate what are things that are really going to inform my practices moving forward. And we have to realize that methods are many, but principles are few. So when things inform principles, or they really reinforce certain principles, these are things that we can they're more substantiated.
Yeah. And kind of like you said too, it's like, over a couple of years, you're probably not going to make huge changes in terms of like the way of thinking, but like you said, you're always trying to get better and always evolving there. And there's always new research coming out, and like you said, you need to make sure that, you are, like you said, I don't think you need to change everything, but again, continue to move forward. And funny that you brought that up, because my question was going to be initially was, what would be the kind of calorie balance that you would have these women in? And you answered it right there, 0.25% to about 1%. So actually answered that right there. So no, man, a ton of great information in here, and a lot to take away and for people to apply to their own training, and coaches as well, and even myself as well. So appreciate all the information in here, man. Anything else you want to hit on real quick before we let you go, or anything that you want to, anywhere we want to lead the audience to, or anything like that?
No, absolutely. So we'll just wrap this up, guys. First and foremost, Jeff, thank you for having me on for another 2-part series. It's been a minute since we've done some deep dives, so I'm glad that we got to do this, and I hope that this series provides you with even your own food for thought, more so, because these are how my views have evolved, and I often, within this series, I went through how they've changed from my own experience as a practitioner and as a coach, but also I highlighted a lot of the evidence, a lot of the research that has come out in the last 2 to 3 years. So hopefully that also inspires you guys, that if someone that's 10 plus years into this, like that's an experienced coach, I've worked with over 1,000 people at this point. If I can change my thoughts, if I can evolve my thoughts, we should all be open-minded, not so open-minded that your head falls out, but open-minded enough that you're able to take on new information and allow it to influence your ability to be objective, honest, and really do the best work moving forward. But besides that, guys, you can always reach me on Instagram, which is at Brandon DaCruz _ for any emails, inquiries, things of that sort. You guys can reach me at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And if you guys are into podcasts, which I'm assuming you are, because you're listening to Mind Muscle Connection, be sure to check me out on Spotify or iTunes. It is the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast, and I do a deep dive every single week. So I would love to have you guys check it out and give me some thoughts.
Yep, absolutely, man. You want more Brandon? Go check out that podcast for sure. So cool, man. Again, appreciate your time, and we'll get you back on here again soon.
Oh yeah.